right, we're going to get started. Welcome to the session on removing barriers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer questioning, and two-spirited and intersex athletes. My name's Danielle Piers. I'm queer, genderqueer, ex-Paralympian, a settler here on Treaty 6 territory, and also now do a little research on the side. I just want to outline that, recent research by Out on the Field shows that 84% of people who participate in sport have witnessed or experienced homophobia. So it's very, very rampant. And the statistics there don't talk about transphobia, which I suspect is actually quite much higher. Further, the highly gendered binary nature of most sport and rec programming often make participation either unsafe or just actually impossible for trans and gender non-binary participants. Yet things like gay games and other kind of LGBTQ sport rarely have programs that are accessible for disabled participants. So I'm thrilled today to introduce two former Paralympic athletes and current disability sport leaders to talk about their experiences in sport and how we might reduce barriers to our full participation. First up is Vivienne Forêt, who has won multiple gold medals for Canada at both Summer and Winter Paralympics. And goalball and in alpine ski racing. I sort of joke that I just want to have you in a new sport to see if you can win a medal in that too. Vivienne now works as a registered massage therapist and a broadcast presenter for Accessible Media Incorporated. And Stephanie Wheeler also has won her share of Paralympic gold medals, many of them over top of me, in the sport of wheelchair basketball. Stephanie is now head coach both the U.S. women's national team and University of Illinois women's team. First of all, thank you both for coming and sharing your perspectives. We're just going to do this as a Q&A, so I'm going to ask a question, and one or either can answer, and if they don't like the question, they can just look at me sternly, and I'll move on. So the first question is really, was there a time in your athletic career when you chose not to be out, and why?
I definitely choose not for many reasons. Actually, I never think I really make a formal coming out, so I guess here I am.
Welcome.
For the people, close to me, it was clear, everybody kind of knew, but I never make a public announcement or any of that. I was extremely difficult, 20 years ago. I was playing a sport and the coach was pretty much homophobic. The irony of her story is I was with my girlfriend for 3 years before we told the team, and the whole dynamic changed. So I did find it was very difficult, but a lot of hypocrisy as well. So if we don't really know, it's kind of cool, or we're gonna more tolerate it. But if we're out, it was a lot of problem. We start to have a lot of discrimination, been put aside. It ended up that my girlfriend didn't go to a Paralympic game because of that. So it was very difficult. I went to those Paralympic games, but it was not a good experience. There was a lot of physical harassment and emotional harassment from the coach. So it was not a good experience. One of the physio was attached to our team, told me right away, she said, they harass you mentally, and I said, yeah, but what could I do? I was stuck in that. So after the game, it's start long procedure, and finally this coach have been fired, which was kind of good. And but it was, it's leaves some scarf, and 20 years later, I'm not sure I'm healed. I still dream about him, and I kind of don't like him still, unfortunately. And still for my girlfriend. So sport is it's all her passion, it's all her life, and when someone don't want you because you're gay or what you do in your bedroom, what is quite private, or religion or those kind of things, I find it's extremely it hurt people quite deeply inside.
Yeah, I would say for me, mine was sort of a process of discovery and figuring out who I was and being okay with that. I think more so than choosing not to be out, it was I needed to figure out who I was. And that was mostly during my time competing. I actually didn't come to that discovery on my own until towards the end of my competing career. I would say the last couple of years. And then it was, it sort of like your story, it was just sort of, there was no formal process. It was just, this is it, right? And so for me, it wasn't necessarily that I chose not to be out. It was just I was still in a discovery period and didn't really understand those parts about myself either. Certainly not in as much of a homophobic environment as you were, but my discovery process, I think, basically stems from where I grew up and how I grew up and sort of my experiences growing up in the southern United States, which were very religious-based and homophobic just in general. It's a huge generalization about one part of our country, but it's very much so that way. So I think a lot of my sort of inability to come to terms with who I was stemmed from that process. So I don't necessarily think I didn't choose to not come out, but certainly didn't feel comfortable with who I was.
Great. Were there moments that you sort of decided, where you had a decision about being more or less public? And if you did, what sort of made you choose to be more public? Or to be on this panel, as the case may be.
I guess I choose to be on the panel because I still have a concussion. I didn't realize. No, it's a joke. Because I retired, I find for me it was when I was competing. I find it very difficult to be out in front of everybody because I'm quite of a private person, I believe. But like I did downhill skiing after. I faced some homophobia as well competing there, but not as much, more like comment, you shouldn't look that butch or that kind of thing. I was like, oh, whatever. But I didn't want to be out when I was competing and face the media and the sponsorship too. It's like some people are like, okay, if you're out, you could have our sponsor, but you lose those. And it's like, oh, it's like I just want to compete. I don't want to be involved with politics or sexual orientation. I'm not there to, I don't know, make a point of anything. I just want to be an athlete and compete to my best ability. So now that I'm retired, I'm pleased to talk more about how it could be a bit sometimes the old boys school and the sports system, but I believe it changed, and sometimes homophobia, I find out it came often from only one person, and if it could be like a very corrosive energy, and it could corrupt quite of an atmosphere and a team spirit.
And I think for me, it kind of goes back to what I spoke about earlier today about bringing all of who I am and the best of who I am to what I do. And once I sort of discovered that, okay, like I'm a lesbian and this is who I am, and I was okay with that on my own, I struggled and I found it really challenging to bring my best to the court and bring my best to what I did. And it was, I think it was probably about 2 years that I was competing while I was out. And like I said, there was never any formal sort of declaration about it, but it weighs heavy on you when you're hiding such a big piece of yourself and afraid to talk about that piece of who you are. And I found that my performance suffered a bit. And so it just became something to where, I wanted to talk about it with my teammates. My teammates were talking about their partners and their significant others and or their experiences, and I wanted to be able to share the same things about who I was and what was going on in my life. And so for me, it wasn't sort of a political statement or anything like that. It was more of like, I just wanted to bring my best to what I was doing. At that point in time as well, I was beginning to transition into coaching. And I knew straight away that I didn't want to coach without having this piece of me very visible, because there's so much homophobia attached to coaching, and especially women in coaching. And I was starting my doctoral studies at that time too, and it was sort of informing everything about who I wanted to be. And so I knew that from the moment that I started coaching, I didn't want to hide. I didn't want to hide who I was, who my partner was. I wanted my team and my athletes to know, and I also wanted them to know that it was okay for whatever intersecting identities they brought to our team, that it was okay to be who they were. So those were my main reasons for saying, okay, this is the time to do it. This is, if you know, that's great. If you don't know, then, that's fine too. But I wasn't going to actively hide who I was anymore.
I was going to ask specifically about whether there was tension around coaching, because I know when I transitioned from an athlete to a coach in mainstream sport, I was specifically told that a particular college would not hire a coach that was out and gay in any way. And so I'm curious whether, in particular with coaching, what are we going to do about locker room, all these kinds of things that come up around it. I'm wondering whether you had any kinds of tension in that particular position.
I think I've been very fortunate to where I didn't. And I think I'm one of the few that have really positive stories about being an out coach. When I was hired at the University of Illinois, one of the first questions that our program director asked was, would I need insurance for my partner? Would I need to include her on anything? Would she be coming with me? Those were literally some of the first questions. And I think that kind of gets to some of the other questions we're going to talk about. But some of those initial barriers that I think especially out female coaches tend to face, I didn't face. Now, whether some of those things were said or done in private or behind my back, I'm not aware of. But personally for me, and I think I'm really fortunate, one of the fortunate few, I never really felt any of that tension between what are we going to do in the locker room? Can she be in there when the girls are changing? As a coach, I don't really want to be in there anyway. That's their time and space to be and do what they want to do. But yeah, I think I've been really fortunate. And with our national team too, that was never really a question as I was going through my hiring process for the national team. And I don't think that, it didn't impact my ability to get the job. I got the job, and I was able to lead our team. And I think it created open space. We had two or three out athletes on our team, and my assistant coach was out as well. So I think it allowed me the opportunity to sort of, break down some of those thoughts and barriers.
Great. I know when I transitioned from mainstream sport to disability sport, it was very unsafe to be out in mainstream sport. And there was just, one person on one team who was out and made a really big difference and helped me decide that wheelchair basketball was for me. So I'm wondering if both of you could tell me maybe about a time or experience where an LGBTQ affirming person or space made parasport inclusive rec better or safer or more fulfilling, if you'd ever sort of had a ally or a space or an event that was helpful for you.
I think I always have a place for improvement, and for sure, this is inclusion. I think more today people are aware that we're all different, and but it's to every federation and sport to want to be more involved. Today, if I will change anything of what happened to me in the past, is I will probably go talk with my federation way before it went to a point that you have no return with that coach, and it was so bad. But for sure, we need more people to stand for each other.
This gives me the opportunity to do this. I've never had a chance to do this before, but Danielle is actually one of the people who made parasport an open and welcoming place for me, so thank you. You're one of the first people that I met who was open and proud about who they were. And that was really important for me as someone who is kind of in a discovery process about who they were. And that was really important. And to be really honest, there was no one on my USA national team at that point in time who was out. It wasn't homophobic. There were no, comments or anything like that. But there wasn't anyone who was out that was on the team, what I would say. But interacting with the Canadian women's national team, that was huge. That was absolutely huge, and I think that sort of drew me in a little bit. It's oh, okay, this is a safe space. I think the other person for me, and I spoke about him in our earlier panel, is actually my coaching mentor. Mike Frogley, and he was one of the people who, when I first actually never came out to him, and he's a huge person in my life. I actually never came out to him. He sort of came up to me and he's like, "Hey, can we talk about something?" And just came at it from a perspective of it doesn't matter. If this is a piece of who you are, that's great. It doesn't change the way I feel about you. It doesn't change what value you bring to our sport, and it doesn't change the value that you bring to what we do. And that, again, someone who I care about so much and who's had such a profound effect on my life and my career, hearing them say that and affirming in that moment was just huge, because I didn't get that from my family. So for me personally, I've had more positive experiences and support from my sporting community and my sporting family than I have from my actual family. So I think I've had some experiences that I think are counter to some, what some have had in sport, I think, recently. So.
I think it's telling that when we were fitting this panel, it was relatively easy to find out female-identified lesbians in parasport, and incredibly difficult to find out trans, genderqueer, and gay male athletes. And so, obviously, you can't speak from your own experience in this, but I'm wondering if you can speak to if you think there are different barriers or different experiences for those athletes in parasport.
I think it's very personal. I mean, I find it hard sometimes to see like the positive aspect of coming out, and I think maybe it's what a lot of athletes are afraid of. Like maybe they don't see why. Maybe we'll take the weight out of their shoulder. For me, like I say, I was not out in public, but my coach, my teammates, the federation was aware that I was gay, and that was the way it was. So, maybe I was one foot in the closet, one foot out. I don't know how to say.
I would say out in the living room, but not on the street.
Yeah, certainly can only speak from my experiences, but just from having conversations with either trans individuals who are competing in sport or the few out gay men. I think I've personally met, in my sport, again, I can only speak from my sport, one out gay man in my sport. The conversations have evolved, especially with him, have evolved around just like the heteronormativity and the masculinity that he is supposed to present in sport, right? And I think with that whole piece of being gay, like that's where his fear, I think, came around, was that, he wouldn't be seen in that way. And I think with trans individuals, I can't speak for their experiences. What I do know is that with certain policies that are in place, it's completely exclusionary for a lot of trans individuals or non-gender binary individuals to even think about competing in sport or to have a place where they feel safe in sport. Because of policies that are in place, policies that can be changed and modified, and just with a simple modification of, you don't have to be on hormones or you don't have to be transitioning in order to compete, like that would completely change the sporting landscape, I would imagine, for those individuals. That's about all the experience I have with that.
I can say I worked for 7 years with one particular parasport organization, national level, writing best policies, writing different versions of the policy, and they just basically refused to pass it. Mm-hmm. So there's just a lot of tension.
Yeah, and a lot of sport organizations don't even have policies. Like, I know our governing body in the U.S. there's nothing there, nothing.
I met one transgender. She was a female. She went for male, and she was playing goalball for Australia. I know she did have a period of time she was not allowed to compete, probably because of the hormone therapy. And a few years later, like, people were like, that was the girl, but that's 20-some years ago again. I believe it's kind of depend on which country they're from, but I think, everybody's out there, and we just have to make our way and convince people that everybody needs a place to compete and a fair place and equity.
What do you think are the biggest things that everyone here, that inclusive sport and rec organizations, coaches, administrators can do to make sport and rec more inclusive for all of us?
I guess it's against, like, we have to have more inclusive people. We need people who have open mind. I guess more people like us who's old now and come out. I mean, I think if everybody knows someone and are a bit more aware, it's kind of take a bit of the fear, and we're just human, and we just are like everyone else.
I have a little list that I've prepared.
I'm taking notes.
I think things that I've kind of just learned over the years that have either I've done or that I've heard of other people doing that have been really important. I think the first is like we have to assume that all of our athletes or people in our organizations bring intersecting identities to the table, and so there's not an assumption of the white male heterosexual coming to our sporting environments, right? And so it's having that assumption that we all are going to bring some kind of intersecting identity, and then I am very verbal about that within my team, and I talk about that, and I talk about it a lot, and because it's important that they feel that this is a safe environment. Actually saying the words, like say the word lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, queer, question, I think saying the words and having the individuals in your organizations or your athletes hear you say them, that automatically I think creates that space where like, okay, they're trying. Whether or not they do it the exact right way, they're at least trying and they'll say the words. I think if you come into contact with someone who is really struggling to say those words or who refuses to say them at all, I think that lets you know that that space could possibly be unsafe. I think having visible markers up, like in the US, I'm not sure what the training looks like here in Canada, but in the US we have on our campuses, we have our ally training, or we have safe space training, or we have different trainings that you can go through, or even if you don't go through a training, you have up some kind of marker that lets individuals know that this is a safe space where you can come in if you need to talk, or if you have questions about those types of things. So I think that's really important. With my team, I immediately address any kind of unsavory behaviors, comments, anything like that, straight away. If there's any kind of homophobic language or anything that is said or done within our program, it's addressed straight away. Nothing like that sort of is allowed to perpetuate amongst the young student athletes in our program. And using it as a teaching moment for them and not just saying, oh, it's just locker room banter, or it's just how athletes talk. Those kind of words and moments, that creates culture, and that creates unsafe space for those who either are LGBTQ or who are questioning or who are not sure who they are at that point in time. And I think it creates that space where they don't feel safe coming out those little microaggressions. Let's see if I covered my list. And I think lastly, giving underrepresented individuals opportunities to either work in your organization, be a part of your team. I made sure when I was coaching on our national team, I brought in another out lesbian coach because that was really important to me to have her on our staff. Let them lead on committees, let them take leadership roles. Not let them, but provide space for them to take leadership roles so that there's that diversity of thought and diversity of experience within decisions that are being made. I think that's really important too. So those are just a few things that I've thought about.
We'll open it up for questions or questionings.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. One of the questions I sat in on a cause seminar the other day, and they were talking about One Team, which is from the Canadian Olympic Committee. So kind of how Stephanie was talking about the safe spaces, you can have a poster up or have something to recognize that this is a safe space for your athletes to go. Do you think that the Paralympic movement is ready for a One Team kind of approach where we can have something that's, I don't know if we need to, either assimilate with the Olympic, but I mean, Danielle, you maybe thought about this before working in the national level programs within Canada, but I know I have a couple of women on my national team who, any chance we get to celebrate them, and they love to speak openly about their partners and about their lifestyle as being an athlete who's currently active, but they don't necessarily feel they have a platform to do so right now within the Paralympic world. So I don't know if you've had any experience with that or seen any movements happening within Canada to try and get that more out there and give these women, in my case, opportunities to be role models or be what they want for the future generations of para-athletes in Canada.
Is there a U.S. equivalent? Or?
I don't think we have a U.S. equivalent on the Olympic or Paralympic side, but I know there's a lot of organizations in the U.S., LGBT Sports Safe, Outsports. There's a couple of different organizations that do take out athletes, whether they're Olympic or Paralympic, and I know I've been a big proponent of pushing more Paralympic athletes towards them to lift them up on a platform and to let them speak about their experiences of being out and being out in sport and how that's benefited them. So are we ready? Possibly in the US. I question that a little bit at this moment, maybe, but I think in our collegiate sports system, we've seen it a lot more, athletes be a lot more visible, I think, through some of those different organizations. I think we saw at our last Olympic Games, we had a couple of out athletes who were pretty heavily promoted and who were competing at a pretty high level. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think it's moving towards the right direction in that way. Yeah, I'm not sure if that exactly gets to what you're asking.
I think we'll have to sit down with the Paralympic Committee and see if what they think about that. Maybe that's the first step, and I mean, like every movement or everything, we have to start somewhere. I don't necessarily think we have to wait if people are ready or not, because it's not how we make change or improvement in society. Mm-hmm. So I think now it's a good time, and probably Danielle's probably the best person to kind of start.
I feel like you all organize this for me.
No pressure.
I think one thing that needs to be really careful about those sort of things, I think those movements tend to hold up the most palatable lesbian subject, and often don't deal well with intersectionality, don't deal well with gender queerness, don't deal well with, I think, any kind of like queerness per se. And so I'd say if we're going to do it, we got to do it right, and not in a way that just is about the sort of trickle down of the most privileged, non-privileged. One last question. Awesome. Our next, what time is our next thing? Oh, we do have a question? Oh. We have a question.
Thank you very much. I have a very, very, very hard question for Stephanie. I hope you all you can answer it. So, as a head coach of the Team USA, the team is actually a symbol of the nation state, as a symbol of patriotism and nationalism. And at the same time, I think there has been a lot of discussion and debates going on in the boundary of the USA in regards to many social injustices that has happened to many groups, including the LGBTQ group, including African Americans, including American Indians, indigenous peoples, and besides, I think it is important to also notice that the role that the state of USA has played internationally in terms of its mission, in terms of trying to graft democracy in many other territories. So I was just wondering, as the head coach of Team USA, have you had to address this type of conflicts, if ever? And if so, how do you do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question. I think from my perspective, and I'm in a very privileged position with that, but I think my perspective, one of the things and one of the reasons why I wanted to be out as a coach, especially coaching Team USA, is because I think that my team, as much as we possibly could, with the privilege that our athletes brought to that perspective, we did represent sort of the ideal of what we wanted our nation to represent, right? And so I to be honest with you, I've never had to address this in front of a crowd and never had to answer that, I think because Paralympic sport doesn't get some of that attention that we see our more mainstream sports getting in the US right now, like with the NFL and everything that's going on in those spaces. But I think what was important for me in the construction of our team as much as we possibly could, and the way that we presented ourselves and the athletes that we put in front of individuals, that our view of patriotism and nationalism represented one of equality as much as we could. Again, I think that we saw a lot of privilege in the athletes that we did have on that team. And I'm not sure if I'm exactly addressing your question, but I'm trying to sort of get to it to the best of my knowledge. And I think we were understanding of sort of who we were representing, and we wanted to make sure that in everything that we did, as much as we possibly could, our team represented what we thought and what we hoped was the best of our country, right? And the hopes of what we think patriotism is from our perspective. Possibly not necessarily what is happening right now. That's a tough one to
A loaded one under Trump.
It's a loaded question, it really is, and it's one where I'm happy to talk about it. I think it takes a while to suss some of that stuff out, but that's why I wanted to be out, and that's why I was okay speaking about it, because I wanted to be a representative from our country who I think represents the good in the U.S. and the good of what we can be.
And on that note, thank you very much, Viviane and Stephanie, and thank you all for being here. Our next session starts at 2:15.